Good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I co-direct the Future Security Initiative, which is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. This is part of our fall speaker series, and we're really thrilled to have with us a faculty member in the Future Security Initiative, Ambassador David Scheffer. The title of his presentation is, "Will Putin be Prosecuted for War Crimes? The Future of Investigations into International Law Violations in Ukraine." Ambassador Scheffer has spent decades at the forefront of international criminal justice. From 2006 to 2020, he was the Mayer Brown Robert A. Helman Professor of Law at Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law, and he's the Director Emeritus of the Center for International Human Rights there at Northwestern. From 2012 to 2018, he was the UN Secretary General's special expert on UN assistance to the Khmer Rouge Trials in Cambodia, and he was the first US Ambassador at Large for War Crimes issues from 1997 to 2001, where he led the US delegation to UN talks establishing the International Criminal Court. He received the Berlin Prize in 2013. He was named a top global thinker of 2011 by Foreign Policy magazine. Ambassador Scheffer is the author of many articles and books, including All the Missing Souls, A Personal History of the War Crimes Tribunals, and The Sit Room in the Theater of War and Peace. So we're thrilled to have all of you with us this evening and very pleased to have Ambassador Scheffer. Very briefly, Ambassador Scheffer will speak for a period of time, and then we'll go to Q&A, and I'll just ask all of you to drop your questions into the question box in Zoom, and I'll play the role of moderator. So thank you again, and David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Professor Rothenberg. It's a tremendous pleasure of mine to speak to our, I presume, largely ASU audience. I'm a very proud professor of practice with you all, based in the Washington, D.C. offices, and teach a range of courses, including currently a course that I'm co-teaching with Dr. Victor Peskin at ASU. The topic tonight was selected some time ago, and I just want to indicate to our audience that I am perfectly prepared to, particularly in the question and answer period, to also address the Israel-Hamas war from the perspective of accountability and of the kind of allegations that are obviously very prominent in the news regarding the conduct both of Hamas and of the Israeli Defense Forces at this time. So I think I'll leave that for sort of questions and answers, and I'd be happy to get into that because I know it's at the top of the news and it's on a lot of people's minds. It's also a very comparative point with respect to the issue before us in this particular session, which is Putin and the Ukraine war. Let me just start by answering the question. Will Putin be prosecuted for war crimes? Well, it depends, as so many questions in law evoke that answer. It depends. Vladimir Putin, as president of Russia, has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. And we all know that from the news from last April of this year. A colleague of his in the government, Maria Lvova-Belova, who was his commissioner for children's rights, was indicted along with him on the same charges, which are the war crimes of unlawful deportation or transfer or unlawful confinement of individuals during wartime, civilians, and also deportations or transfer of all or parts of a population of the occupied territory within or outside the occupied territory. And that, of course, refers to what you've all read in the news now ever since February of 2022, which is the incredibly insidious phenomenon of Ukrainian children being corralled in the occupied part of eastern Ukraine, sometimes in camps, filtration camps as they're called, and then deported, transferred onto Russian territory, and delivered to Russian families, which then are tasked to raise these young children. It's a rather, you cannot imagine that this would have happened in the year 2023, and yet that is exactly what has happened in Ukraine. And the numbers of children involved are wildly all over the map. We don't really know the exact count. It can range from 6,000 to more than 100,000, 150,000 children. We don't know the exact number, but it is very, very significant. And therefore, it was essentially low-hanging fruit for the court of jurisdiction. And that court is the International Criminal Court. Let me explain that just briefly, and then we'll get back to the whole arrest warrant and the Putin phenomenon, which is Ukraine is not a state party to the International Criminal Court. So people might ask, wait a minute, why does the ICC have jurisdiction? Neither is Russia a state party to the International Criminal Court. And yet Ukraine, years ago, in late 2013, 2014, signed what is called an Article 12.3 declaration under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which essentially invited the court to have jurisdiction over Ukrainian territory with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine that began in late 2013. And as you'll recall, Crimea was completely taken over. There are parts of eastern Ukraine that were occupied. And those two declarations back to back that Ukraine approved at the time have established the long-term jurisdiction of the court over Ukrainian territory. Even though Ukraine is not a state party, one can consent to the court having jurisdiction for a particular situation, even though one is a country is a non-party. So that's what happened. And yet it was incredibly reinforced in March of 2022, weeks after the invasion, the full-scale aggressive invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces in February of 2022, that reality of the ICC's jurisdiction over Ukraine was significantly reinforced with an unprecedented referral by 43 states parties of the International Criminal Court of the Ukraine situation to the ICC. The importance of that is that under the Rome Statute, if states refer a matter to the prosecutor, he can immediately launch an investigation, a full-scale formal investigation as a prosecutor into the situation. And that is exactly what he did, as opposed to it being what we call under preliminary examination, which under that scheme, he then has to ultimately go to a pretrial chamber of judges and convince them that he can launch an official investigation, which was essentially the situation in Ukraine until February of 2022, under that earlier declaration that Ukraine had made. But now he had the weight of 43 states parties behind him, and he didn't have to go to the judges. He can just start his investigation, which is exactly what Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the ICC, did in March of 2022. So the investigation is underway as of March of 2022, a formal investigation by the ICC. And the child deportation issue was the low-hanging fruit. It was obvious. It was blatantly blaring out at the world that this was happening. Why? I mean, why would I say that? because Putin himself incriminated himself constantly about it. He kept talking with great pride about about how Russian forces were essentially seizing these children and deporting them to Russia into the hands of very loving families, or whatever, however you want to describe them. He'd hold big stadium rallies where he'd trumpet these children, put them on stage, and have them hugged by their surrogate parents suddenly. So all of it was just kind of screaming into the face of the prosecutor, as if Putin was saying, look, I can actually commit a war crime. I can do it. Here it is. I'm doing it. And his commissioner for children's rights, Belova, was right there with him on the screen, trumpeting her triumph at doing it. In fact, she even took one of them into her family, one of these children. So these were low-hanging fruit, and that's why it just wasn't that difficult for the prosecutor, because of the public display of criminal conduct by Putin and Belova, to issue what we call an arrest warrant by the ICC. We don't really use the word indict, but it's sort of easy, colloquial to use the word. But their terminology is they issued an arrest warrant against Putin and Belova in March sorry, so very, very early April of 2023. So that is the first step that's been taken. But the International Criminal Court is a leadership accountability court, which means that first, Putin is almost certainly being lined up for a whole stream of additional arrest warrants on a whole category of war crimes, probably of crimes against humanity, and possibly even of genocide. And the reason I say genocide is because it is the genocide charge that brings us back to children. Under the genocide terms in the Rome Statute, which are drawn from the Genocide Convention, the movement of children from the protected group, which in this case is the national group of Ukrainians, into another group, namely the Russians, is genocide. You don't have to just have mass killing for there to be genocide. You can also have conditions that point towards the destruction of all or part of a national, racial, ethnic, or religious group, which could be, for example, a mass starvation situation, a mass movement situation, anything that would just create the conditions that would lead to the deterioration and elimination of a substantial part of a group or all of the group. Well, one of the acts of genocide is this movement of people from a protected group to another group, children. And so that is a directly on point issue that I think the prosecutor, I'm sure, is looking at in terms of the possibility of bringing a genocide charge against Putin and others with respect to the children, and possibly widening it to a larger group of Ukrainian victims among the civilian population as a national group, a protected group. So that, I think, is all going to come down the pike. And others in the Russian government will also be subject, and I'm sure are the current subject of investigation, which would include Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. It would include the defense minister, Shoiga, S-H-O-I-G-A, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. These are two prominent high officials that have been at Putin's side throughout this, defending him and also executing the policies that he has been directing them to execute with respect to the aggression against Ukraine. The other charge that Putin will no doubt be very exposed to, along with these other high officials, will be the crime of aggression. Now, under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, there is the crime of aggression. And yet, for reasons which I won't go into detail on here because it gets, it could be a long story. You can ask me questions if you want. The fact is that the crime of aggression cannot be investigated and prosecuted by the International Criminal Court with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Why? Because Russia is a non-party state. It's not party to the ICC, and there's a special carve-out for countries with respect to the crime of aggression, whereby their nationals cannot be prosecuted if they, in fact, are part of a government that is not a party to the court on the issue of crime of aggression, even though they're committing the crime of aggression on the territory of a state that is either a state party to the court or has invited the court's jurisdiction, such as Ukraine has, onto its territory. The crime of aggression has an exclusive carve-out on being applied to a non-party state. So that leaves the crime of aggression hanging, and yet it is the prominent context of Ukraine is the crime of aggression of a character we haven't seen since World War II. And so a lot of us believe, and I'm part of this group, a lot of us believe it's absolutely essential that the top officials of Russia be brought to account for the crime of aggression. It would be rather untenable for aggression of this character to go unpunished, and for history to look back at this period and basically say, look, you guys, you blew it. I mean, are you telling me that in the most blatant form of aggression, you could not figure out how to hold people accountable for it? So what a lot of, a group of us, particularly in academia, but also in civil society, and in a core group of governments at the United Nations, led, by the way, by the Principality of Liechtenstein, which punches way above its weight on these issues. There is a proposal on the table to build a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, so that there could be an international criminal tribunal specially built simply for this particular situation and this particular crime of aggression, and to address it very directly. And to do so that individuals such as President Putin, such as Lavrov, such as Sorgoy, cannot claim head of state immunity, which is a very time-honored principle of international law that you simply cannot, while individuals are in their highest offices of government, have a foreign court outside of that person's government and country, have a foreign court dare to hold them to account for any criminal conduct or even civil conduct that is illegal. It allows for a free movement of these very high officials around the world and dealing with other countries diplomatically and otherwise without fear of being arrested. The only way you can defeat that claim of immunity is if you have an international criminal court, such as the ICC, actually operating and indicting that individual and seeking an arrest of that individual. The ICC has that capacity for the states parties that have accepted the crime of aggression, which is a particular procedure under the Rome Statute. But in this case, Russia is off deck. It's a non-party state. It's not part of that regime of law. And so we have to think of a different way of getting at this. And that would be a special tribunal, which we have proposed, our group of advocates for this proposal, which is, by the way, the Ukrainian government's proposal. They finally adopted what we had put on the table a year earlier. They finally adopted it in the spring of 2023 in a major address by President Zelensky at The Hague, in which the General Assembly of the UN would direct the Secretary General to negotiate a treaty between the UN and the government of Ukraine to build an international criminal court for this purpose. And so you'd have a treaty between the UN and Ukraine. And this follows from examples from the 1990s, where we built special war crimes tribunals for Sierra Leone and for Cambodia, and then in the mid-2000s for Lebanon, in which we have this treaty arrangement, creating courts that, as I call them, are sort of joint venture courts along with the UN, between a national government and the UN. Anyway, this proposal is out there, circulating at the General Assembly. It has not picked up enough support yet to bring it to a vote, which is unfortunate. The US government decided not to support the proposal, and instead they came out with what they suggested would be an internationalized court in Ukraine to prosecute the crime of aggression. The good news is that the United States actually publicly stated that they believe the crime of aggression should be prosecuted. That was a very positive step by the US. And yet then they said the way to do it would be through a Ukrainian court holding Putin accountable for aggression. That doesn't quite work. And the US knows it, because Putin would just claim in front of a Ukrainian court head of state immunity, and they would have to grant it to him unless they kind of go against public international law in a big way. And so it's really kind of an unrealistic proposal. And of course, Putin is never going to let himself appear before a Ukrainian court. So anyway, that's where it stands at this point. So we have this sort of lingering problem of how to prosecute the crime of aggression. But I do think ultimately a way will be found and Putin will be indicted on the charge of aggression. We'll get there somehow. I want to move from there to simply also just point out to you that on this indictment that is against Putin from the ICC, he's being indicted both for his individual criminal responsibility with respect to the deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia, but he's also being charged under what we call superior responsibility, which is that as a civilian leader, he is actually overseeing the actions of subordinates, directing them and enabling them without any punishment whatsoever, but rather encouragement, to join in a collective effort to deport these children. So he's got both individual and superior responsibility charges being leveled against him. And that's a kind of a double punch that is going to be tough for him. Now, will he ever appear in a courtroom? You would be surprised. Throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, the cynics were just swamping the argument of, well, would you ever bring the top leaders to justice, whether it be the former Yugoslavia and the Balkans War, Rwanda and the genocide there, Sierra Leone, the civil war there, Cambodia, the Pol Pot regime of the late 1970s. All of these had top leaders of their countries on deck for prosecution. And they all fell under the jurisdiction of these courts. And I mean, I won't go through the list, but they were indicted, investigated, prosecuted, convicted. Milosevic, the head of Serbia, he was actually prosecuted. The trial went on forever. And he just happened to die before the final days of the trial. So we never got a judgment against Slobodan Milosevic, who was head of Serbia and responsible for so much carnage in Bosnia and Croatia. But the point is, he was on trial. And there are many other examples. Charles Taylor of Liberia, successfully prosecuted and convicted and jailed for 50 years now. That's his sentence for his role in the civil war within Sierra Leone. And the surviving top leaders of the Pol Pot regime face justice and convictions. And of course, Rwanda, the whole cast of top leaders in Rwanda, including Kabanda, who was the prime minister of Rwanda, or president, he was convicted as well. So I would just say, when it comes to Putin, I would not be surprised if a day will arrive where he loses political power in Russia, and political forces decide that it's to their advantage to actually remove him from the scene in Russia and essentially just dump him in The Hague, and let him fight for his own legal survival in The Hague. It might be tough to imagine that, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, Putin is still alive and finds himself in that predicament. After all, you have to remember that Putin is now ostracized in most of the world. Even if a country has has a good relationship with Russia, or has a trading relationship with Russia, or is sympathetic to the Russian position with respect to Ukraine and the invasion of it, etc. The problem is it cannot deal thoroughly and completely with Russia in terms of the leadership of Russia now, because Putin really has very little scope for travel outside of Russia. He has to be extremely careful about all of his movements. It's suggested that he just doesn't fly anymore. He only takes the train. So he's constantly aware of his own security and his own situation as an indicted fugitive of the International Criminal Court. It has clearly tarnished his reputation and made him somewhat of a pariah in international circles. And that includes, if you will remember, back in August, there was the BRICS meeting of Brazil, China, India, and Russia. I think I've got all of them there. In South Africa, and many more, some other countries were also invited into the BRICS economic arrangement at that South Africa meeting. But Putin, although initially invited, ultimately decided that he would not attend. South Africa is a state party to the ICC, and there was a very large risk that he would have to be arrested if he landed in South Africa, because he's under arrest warrant. South Africa is obligated as a state party to the ICC to arrest those who are indicted by the ICC if those individuals are on the territory of the state. Bingo. Putin would arrive in South Africa, and that dilemma would confront the South African government. They already went through this experience with al-Bashir of Sudan, who also is indicted for genocide in Darfur. And when he was in power in Sudan, he decided to land in South Africa for important meetings. And the rush was on, though, within South Africa, with great pressure from civil society and from the courts to actually arrest him. And Mr. al-Bashir, in the dead of night, got onto his private government plane and fled South Africa rather than be arrested. That was being suggested would happen again if Putin landed in South Africa. This time there would be a much more organized and immediate effort. And also the opposition party in South Africa insisted that he would have to be arrested. So it was an intolerable situation, and Putin could not go. He sent Lavrov instead. And I sort of surmised at the time in August, well, wait a minute, there could be a sealed indictment against Lavrov. So if Lavrov lands in South Africa, I wonder if that indictment will be unsealed by Prosecutor Khan, and then the South African government would be presented with that challenge of whether or not to arrest Foreign Minister Lavrov. At the G20 meeting in India in September of this year, same issue arose. Oh, not the same issue. I mean, the same question arose for Putin as to whether or not he would attend. Now, India is not a state party to the court, but I think the fact that Putin decided not to attend the G20 meeting in India, and it's again, instead he sent Lavrov, the foreign minister, is extremely important because it shows that even on the territory of a non-party state, which technically, I mean, does not have to arrest him, it's not obligated to do so, he still doesn't go. He's ostracized. Can you imagine if he had landed in India with the G20 meeting? How many of those G20 leaders would dare to be in the same room with him? How many would dare to be photographed with him? How many would dare to dine with him? They would not want that. I mean, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Australians, the Americans, Canada, none of them would enter the room if Putin were there. So it does have a consequence. Now, I know that I'm running on time here. I just want to say, and we can explore this in questions if you wish. I've done some writing, and I've published something in Just Security a couple of months ago on the end game for Ukraine and Russia. There's a war on, obviously, and neither party is prepared at this point to reach the peace table to end the war, the Russian-Ukraine war. So we don't have that prospect yet of peace negotiations. But I did a lot of thinking over the summer about, well, what if there were peace negotiations ultimately between Russia and Ukraine? How would justice fare? What would happen to accountability in those talks? You know, the Russians are going to seek amnesties, and they're going to leverage everything they can so that there actually is no culpability on the part of their leadership. I mean, they'll demand that the ICC stand down, et cetera, et cetera. You know that'll be the Russian position. The Ukrainians are publicly on record as saying they want full accountability. How does that work? How does that work at the peace table? And what I can do is I can get into some of that. And, if you want to ask me questions about, well, how do you leverage justice at the peace table? Or do you even try to leverage justice at the peace table? Very, very critical questions. So with that, Professor Rothenberg, I think I'm going to stand down and let questions commence.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Scheffer. That was really a great description of a very complicated situation. There's so much to talk about in what you discussed, but given that you ended this with the idea that next stages will involve some sort of peace negotiation, we know that the vast majority of conflicts, in fact, end with peace negotiations. We don't know what the timeline of that is. We don't know what the conditions under which that might occur will be. But to get to your point, to what degree do you think that it's a good idea to have justice questions, accountability issues at the forefront of a peace negotiation?
Well, I do have a view on that, but I'm not so stuck with my view that I'm not open to the reality that it could be changed or modified depending upon the circumstances that confront us in a negotiating scenario. But if I were to approach negotiations now, and by the way, the Ukrainians, I think, are pretty determined to have their partners in this struggle with them at the negotiating table. I think they want the United States, they want the European Union at the negotiating table with them. Although they want to control the negotiations, they still want their allies with them at the negotiating table. So it's an important issue to discuss in the State Department and elsewhere. And I think if it were my choice, I would opt for what I describe as the first strategy. And the first strategy would be completely separate the two. Do not intermingle justice with peace objectives at the table. The justice objectives can actually proceed just as they are now. They can proceed on their own steam. Yes, it's complicated, but there's no way that a Ukrainian negotiator is going to sit at that table and persuade Russia to turn Putin over to the ICC. I mean, that's just not going to happen. It's not a realistic proposal to come to the table with, or to say to Russia, please extradite to Ukraine all of those Russian generals that we're going to identify to you so that we can have them prosecuted before Ukrainian courts or under arrest warrants. That's just not to the ICC. That's just not going to happen. So I think it might be more important not to, shall we say, undercut these very important peace objectives that will come to the table with respect to control of territory, with respect to return of the children, with respect to exchange of prisoners of war, with respect to a pledge for non-aggression. All of those are huge issues at the negotiating table. And I'm not so sure that bringing justice to the table will benefit either party, or certainly I'm not so sure it would benefit the Ukrainians to do so. But Daniel, that being said, if you go to what I describe as the second strategy, which is to bring justice to the table, I do think it's unrealistic for Ukraine to simply come in with the demand that all Russian perpetrators will be brought to justice, hand them over. We're going to do a duplicate on, the end of World War II here. It's an unconditional surrender. Please follow the model of the Nazis and of the Japanese. Just turn over all your war criminals. We'll put them on trial. Thank you very much. That's not going to happen. So then it actually becomes a kind of interesting question. Well, what could Ukraine do to actually leverage justice in order to achieve major peace objectives, such as the return of all of their children, such as the return of all Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russia to Ukraine? And of course, Ukraine has to turn their prisoners of war back to Russia. That's under the Geneva Convention. But also reparations, the whole issue of the reconstruction of Ukraine, how's it going to be paid for, the frozen Russian assets, which everyone or a lot of people are strategizing now should be seized for this purpose. So one can spin out some scenarios in which there could be some delay in the administration of justice in order to achieve some of those political objectives. In other words, Ukraine would have to compromise on the issue of justice. It doesn't have to walk away from justice, but there are tactics and strategies that can be used to compromise. And for example, I think the low-hanging fruit on that would be, wait a minute, you want to have a complete exchange of prisoners of war? Okay, then don't prosecute our soldiers that are held in Russia. We won't prosecute your soldiers being held in Ukraine. We'll simply exchange it so that everyone goes home.
David, I have a question.
Yeah.
What do you think about the issue of immunity, let's say selected immunity? We know that in many peace negotiations in different conflicts, the issue of immunity for combatants has been central to what's allowed the negotiation to advance, and yet here, obviously, that would be a potential conflict with issues of accountability.
Absolutely. However, I do think there's space for that concept if Ukraine wants to bring the issue to the table. namely, for purposes of exchange of prisoners of war. A lot of these prisoners of war in Ukraine, the Russians who are held in Ukraine, are subject to prosecution for war crimes. However, the Russians are also claiming that a lot of the soldiers they hold, the Ukrainians, are also subject to prosecution. So there you could have a prisoner of war swap, whereby you drop the charges. These would be charges against the foot soldiers. Now, that's a real tough one, particularly for Ukrainian victims to accept, because they want these soldiers who are held as prisoners of war to be prosecuted. But that would be the trade-off. Namely, you get the Ukrainians back onto Ukrainian territory, the Russians go to Russian territory. The second, and I'll come back to that in a moment, the second category would be the collaborators, Ukrainians who have collaborated with the Russians, particularly in the occupied parts of the East and very much in Crimea. Well, to what extent does Russia care about them if Russia comes to the negotiating table and says, you should not go after our friends in Ukraine, i.e. the Ukrainians who believe in us? Imagine that's even saying that, but that could be essentially the undertone of what they're saying. There could be space there for collaborators who collaborated simply to provide humanitarian, survival to their villages, etc., by collaborating to some extent with the Russians, as opposed to the category of collaborators who really were part of the oppressive, repressive, and criminal conduct of the Russians against Ukrainian civilians. So there could be some room there with collaborators if Russia cares. I think if Russia expresses no interest in protecting those who it worked with, shall we say, in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, Ukraine probably won't, it's just not, Ukraine will go after those people to the extent that they have control over that territory. But I do think there's space there. There's also space in terms of the Security Council has the authority under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court to delay the work of the prosecutor by a year on a situation that it determines has to be dealt with as a peace and security issue and not as a justice issue, which could be the peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. And there could be a proposal that actually both Russia and the United States would agree to in terms of having the peace talks, whereby the prosecutor is directed for 1 year to stand down on either specific investigations or a larger group of investigations with respect to the conflict and the situation in Ukraine. But it's a 1-year deal. At the end of 1 year, unless you get everyone to agree, then the prosecutor is unleashed to continue his work. But that's also an area that could possibly be explored at the peace table.
So we have quite a few questions here from those in attendance. From Skylar Swartz, what type of evidence is needed to try Putin and his associates/cabinet members for crimes against humanity? What would count as a crime versus not a crime in this category?
Well, I think there's a pretty obvious reality there, which is when you look at the character of what has happened in Ukraine, the massive aggressive invasion and the widespread assault on the civilian population of Ukraine, particularly as evidenced by persistent missile attacks against civilian structures and civilian people in Ukraine, it's not very difficult to arrive at a decision that it's representative of, or it's showing a widespread or systematic assault on a civilian population, clearly with knowledge of that attack. That's what you have to meet under the Rome Statute. And crimes against humanity can extend, there's a whole checklist of them, from just outright killing to
Yep.
destruction of civilian property, etc. So I think the crime against humanity charge is almost self-evident. I'll just say very quickly, Daniel, that I found it interesting with the invasion in February of 2022. For a few weeks, we were all talking about Russia committing war crimes in Ukraine because it was being reported. I mean, you could see it happening in Bucha, etc. But it didn't take but about a month or so before we started talking about crimes against humanity, simply because this did appear to be a widespread or systematic assault on a civilian population. And then we started talking about genocide because of the fate of the children.
Sure. A question from Bruce Poggle, retired JAG officer. This might be a little technical for those less familiar, but is the crime of aggression a violation of customary international law? Should countries with the authority to exercise universal jurisdiction consider charging Putin with additional war crimes?
Well, Bruce, it's nice to have your question. Bruce is a fantastic JAG officer, unfortunately retired now. Bruce, I'll just say that potential is clearly there. And I think it's one of the most interesting characteristics of the crime of aggression, that it would be possible. I'm not saying it would succeed in a court of law, but it certainly would be plausible to present that argument as a violation of customary international law, and that customary international law is part and parcel of a nation's national law. In fact, you could make that argument, for the United States if you wanted to make it. I'm not so sure our federal courts would buy it, but it certainly potentially is there. And I wouldn't be surprised if, by the way, in the future, if German courts in particular, and certainly Ukrainian courts, which already have the crime of aggression on their books, but German courts under the universal jurisdiction, and also the fact that they have adopted the crime of aggression in the Rome Statute, would nonetheless have a prosecution in German courts under universal jurisdiction that would apply that principle that a war of aggression is a crime under customary international law.
And a question here from Stephen Batalden. At the time of war, as in Ukraine and Israel, combatants typically justify their killing, claiming that the civilians are inadvertent casualties of war. In these cases, the issue of proportionality is often raised. Could you please explain how the issue of proportionality factors into adjudicating war crimes?
It factors in enormously. There are four principles that have to be followed. Distinction between civilians and the military target. Necessity, is the attack actually necessary to achieve a military target, to take it down? Humanity, is this an issue that are you considering the human elements of the decision appropriately, which is a very subjective concept, but nonetheless the principle of humanity is really the morality and the honor of the military force in terms of the attack on the military objective. And then finally, proportionality, which is that the impact on the civilians cannot be disproportionate to the advantage of hitting the military target. In other words, let me give you an example that is very much in the news, but I mean, there are a zillion examples in Ukraine, but just what's in the news: October 31st, the Jabalia, refugee camp in Gaza, 2 huge Israeli munitions hit that camp. Now, the Israelis claim that this was necessary in order to get to a large tunnel operation of Hamas at that site. They claim that a Hamas commander was killed. And one would think that with that tunnel explanation, perhaps there were, hundreds of Hamas militants possibly, in those tunnels. That's a military objective. Israel acting in self-defense, hitting a military objective, Hamas. But under the proportionality rule, what has to be decided is, well, wait a minute. Our intelligence tells us there's several hundred Hamas forces in those tunnels, clearly a military objective. We need a heavy munition to get at it. But our intelligence also tells us that there's 50, 60, 80, 90 civilians living on top in those buildings. Now, your call. Is the death of 90 civilians a legitimate proportional casualty to the deaths of 300 or 400 Hamas soldiers? In other words, if we're going to kill that many soldiers, then we are entitled. I mean, we can legally kill essentially 80 civilians for the sake of killing 400 soldiers. That's a very tough call. And frankly, it's a call general by general, field officer by field officer, hour by hour, presented with issues of that character. Of course, for that particular attack, that would have been made back in headquarters. And, you know, with your officers at your side in headquarters, your legal officers, your lawyers, your military lawyers advising you with respect to making that decision. But I think in the Ukraine situation, the proportionality test is violated so egregiously by the Russian military that's why it's so much easier to say there's crimes against humanity being committed in the Ukraine situation because of that disproportionate character of civilian deaths. Even though there are lots of military deaths on the battlefields, the Ukrainians are losing a lot of soldiers on the battlefields. The problem is when the Russians hit the civilian villages and cities, that's what's so disproportionate.
Two interesting questions here from Martin Fahey. First, is there a mechanism to force the return of the children taken from Ukraine? And I guess from your perspective, a legal mechanism. And secondly, regarding the Israeli and Hamas conflict, when do the good guys become bad guys?
Yeah.
Related, are the atrocities committed by Hamas seen in the same light as civilian casualties from Israeli efforts against Hamas?
Yeah.
And then added to this, does the ICC factor intent? That's a lot of things.
Yeah, let's leave the third one off for a moment, because otherwise I'll forget it. Okay, so let's go with the first question, which is the children and the Ukrainian children. You know, I can't answer that completely, because I think one can look at certain, you know, treaties and conventions with respect to that issue that might be relevant as to how one secures the return of individuals that are held on foreign territory under certain circumstances. So I don't want to be completely negative to the idea that there are some legal means to insist upon the return. For example, if you're the legitimate parents, you arrive on the foreign territory, you identify your child, you bring a claim of essentially the kidnapping or the hostage taking of that child. I think there are remedies one can follow, even under Russian law. But on the broader scale of it, the answer is actually no. I mean, in the sense that Ukraine is sort of, you know, at the behest of the Russian authorities with respect to identifying where the children are, and then facilitating the arrival of Ukrainian representatives, the parents themselves or others, to actually secure the release of that child and to transport that child back to Ukrainian territory and to their families. That's an incredibly difficult procedure. It has happened in some instances now. There have been some of those returns. So that's hopeful that a procedure has been established for a small number of children to actually return to Ukraine. But I think in any peace negotiations, there'll have to be an agreement for a large-scale operation. And this means actually identifying where the children are in Russia. Extremely difficult. And I'm not so sure the Russians will be cooperative. So that's just a huge problem. But it would be a central point of any peace negotiations, no question. It's a hostage situation, essentially. And so, that would be essential to it. Now, on the the Israel-Hamas war, I think the way I would answer that is that there's just no question that October 7th and the Hamas attack on the Israeli civilians, with the deaths of at least 1,400 and hostages around, about 240, 250 or so, all of that is just egregiously illegal on so many levels. We could talk for the next hour about how many levels of illegality that was. So morally, that's a fairly, I hate to say this, fairly easy call in terms of the illegality of what occurred on October 7th. In response, Israel clearly has the right of self-defense, and it also has the right to eliminate Hamas. That's what I would argue. Just as the United States and others were seeking to eliminate ISIS and Al-Qaeda, those are terrorist organizations. And the fairly unique thing about Hamas, although it is similar to what ISIS did in terms of territory, is that Hamas was actually a governing authority in Gaza, still is, and it had its own forces. And so I don't think one just categorizes Hamas as some sort of errant terrorist organization. Hamas is part of the state of the state of Palestine, as it's called, and it has exercised governmental authority, and it's sent its forces onto Israeli territory. So it's a legitimate target. It's a legitimate entity to eliminate in the self-defense of Israel. But that is to be distinguished from the Palestinian people themselves. And there, I think, Israel has to be extremely careful. And I know I'm treading onto, week by week, the situation, in a sense, sort of deteriorates, because Israel had the high moral ground on October 7th as clearly the victim of an unjustified attack of huge numbers and proportion and egregious character. Israel has to be careful not to lose the high moral ground here. As I've argued, you can take every single airstrike against Gaza, and I hope it's gone through the proper legal review in terms of what was the military objective. Was that weighed on a proportionality basis with respect to the civilians on the site, with respect to the civilian property on the site, of where that military objective of Hamas is? In theory, you want all of that to go through a legal analysis, strike by strike, hour by hour, etc. I'm not so sure that has actually been the case. The numbers are ticking up in a very, very egregious manner, more than 10,000 civilian deaths now. And I think Israel has to be very, very careful that it sticks with the legal procedures that it needs to follow in this attack on Hamas, and to carry through in every respect. If it's asking the Palestinian population, as it has done, to evacuate, actually that's very legal under international law, because that's a tactic to save the people, to protect them, to ensure that they are not subject to the combat that will take place in that theater. You want them to evacuate, but not permanently. You want them to be able to come back afterwards. But if you do have these individuals evacuated, I think there is a responsibility to ensure that they're not being evacuated into what is essentially a death zone, which would be lack of all humanitarian assistance. So Israel has kind of an added burden there. And it's just one that comes with the territory. But they have lots of friends. Israel has the United States, it has the European Union. These are friends that can help on that humanitarian side. And all of that should be coordinated and implemented. I know I'm speaking very generally here. There are 1,000 complications, but I just think Israel has to prioritize that in order to try to stay on the high moral ground here.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Scheffer. I don't know if everybody here knows this, but our colleague is in Italy and it's 2 in the morning over there. So special thanks to you for staying up with us so late. Special thanks also to Tony Roth for doing all the management and logistics of this event. And thanks also to all of you for joining us this evening. We have an event on Thursday. We don't usually have 2 events each week, but 2 days from now, we will have Major General Lorna Malak, the highest ranking Black female officer in the U.S. Marine Corps, who's also the Deputy Director for Combat Support at the National Security Agency. So we're really thrilled to be able to have somebody from an often secretive entity in the United States government speaking with us, who will have a conversation with our colleague, retired Lieutenant General Robert Schmidl. Thursday, 5 to 6 p.m. Arizona time. I'm only mentioning that because you're all here with us. But again, Ambassador Scheffer, thank you so much. That was extremely enlightening, crisp and clear as always from you. Thank you again, and everybody have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much.